So, have you ever wondered why some countries recognize Palestine as a state while others, including Australia, don't? So, what does it really mean to be a state in the eyes of the international law? Today, we're going to be diving deep into these questions, exploring the complex and very controversial issue of Palestine, this whole statehood, and let's break it down into what defines a state under the international law. So, the global debate. Is Palestine a state? Palestine's status right now on the international stage has been a very contentious issue for decades, as more than now 140 nations have recognized Palestine as a state, but of course, Australia is not one of them. This topic has gained significant diplomatic, legal, and political traction, especially in the conflict of Gaza continues without any sort of resolution. Recently, Muslim leaders in Australia pressed Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to make Palestine recognition and a priority, something that was reportedly promised would be addressed within his first term. The Greens have actually also introduced a motion in Parliament to recognise Palestine's statehood, but of course it failed because many countries, including Australia, this prevailing narrative that Palestine's statehood is something that is to achieve in the future once certain conditions are met. But what is much of the world in Palestine's statehood is already a reality. In June of this year, Armenia and Slovenia became the latest states to officially recognize Palestine, following Norway, Ireland, Spain the months before. This brings the global tally to 148 out of the 193 United States membership, which recognize Palestine, edging closer to the 165 that recognize Israel. Despite the majority, Palestine remains an observer state at the UN without the full rights and privileges of a membership. So the big question, what defines a state? So what exactly makes an entity a state under this international law? There are some debates along international lawyers about that criteria, but most widely accepted test is the outlined 1933 Convention of Rights of States and Duties of States. According to this convention, an entity must possess 4 key attributes to be considered a state: a defined territory, a permanent population, a government, has a capacity to enter into other relations with other states. So let's break down these criteria one by one and see how Palestine measures up. First one, a permanent population. A state must have a permanent population. Before the current conflict in Gaza, the population of the Palestine territory was estimated to be over 5 million people. Clearly, the Palestinian meets this criteria with the significant and stable populations living in these claimed borders. So, the capacity to enter into relations with another state. A state must have the ability to enter into relations with other states. Palestine has already demonstrated this capacity, that the country has recognized Palestine engage in these diplomatic relations with its representatives, and Palestine remains on dozens of embassies in the world. It also has missions in countries that yet to formally recognize it. Furthermore, Palestine is a member of very serious international organizations such as the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. This just shows that Palestine is capable of participating in international diplomacy, fulfilling its criterion. And now we go to the third one, which is a defined territory. Here, these things get a little more complicated. We've seen this long-running dispute between Israel and Palestine and where their borders should be drawn. Several of these sort of competing claims exist, including the border sets of the United Nations Partition Plan in 1947. The Green Line, which is the agreement in 1949, is also referred to the pre-1967 borders. This whole post-1967 borders after Israel occupied Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Golan Heights following that 6-day war, the current status quo is much diminished, with Palestinian territories of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. An agreement has sort of been defined in these territories that would satisfy both Israel and Palestine, which has been elusive. However, under this international law, it doesn't necessarily use a state to have these undisputed borders to be recognized. Numerous states, as we've seen, has merged after this dissolution. Soviet Union, which is happen, even though this despite ongoing issues. Therefore, the question of Palestine border really just remains this contentious issue. It doesn't necessarily need to disqualify them from the statehood of this international law. Now, the fourth one, a government, which is a major criteria that a government, in the matter of the debate of the Palestinian case, which is the Palestinian Authority, this was established in 1990s, which is an interim government body to represent the Palestinian territories. However, it has legitimacy in these questions, particularly because no electives have been held since 2006. Additionally, governance in Palestine territories have been divided since 2007, with Hamas controlling Gaza and the Palestinian Authority is sort of retaining its authority over the West Bank. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which one is called the PLO, claims to represent Palestine on a global stage and holds a seat at the UN for the observer state of Palestine. This requirement for this state to possess a government has been applied generously in other cases. For example, the South Sudan gained independence in 2011, a UN peacekeeping mission which was quickly established to support the new government efforts to stabilize and to govern. If a similar interpretation were to be applied, Palestine particularly would have over PA's role in West Bank, then Palestine could be seen as partially satisfying this criteria. And then more so in the ICJ, which is deemed that the Palestinian territories, including Gaza, to be occupied by Israel, which still exercise effective control over this area. A UN membership and a path forward, a vote for this Palestinian statehood has come before both the UN General Assembly and then the Security Council. Meanwhile, 143 states, including Australia, voted in favor for Palestine gaining full UN membership in the General Assembly. Although the Security Council has approved, it's ultimately required. So in April, the United Nations, a permanent member of the veto power, has blocked a Security Council vote on the issue. Until the US position changes, full UN membership for Palestine remains off the table. However, it's important to note that UN memberships is not a prerequisite for a statehood under international law. It is like more recognition or a seal of approval from the global community that has an entity that has met the criteria for statehood. So for example, Switzerland only became a UN member in 2002, but its status as a state was never in question before that. The broader implications for Australia and of course the international community, this was for Australia, its decision not to recognize the Palestinian statehood aligns with several other nations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Germany. These kind of countries really often argue about the recognition should come after a negotiated peace deal that establishes the term of a two-state solution. But the stance is increasingly out of step. The global community has seen this, where a majority of nations have already recognized Palestine. So the debate over Palestine statehood isn't just a legal one, it's a deeply political and involves broader questions about international justice, peace, and of course, the right to self-determination. As the conflict in Gaza continues and the international pressure builds, Australia and other holdout countries may find themselves increasingly isolated to their refusal to recognize Palestine. And this conclusion shows a question of justice and law. So is Palestine a state? Legally, it appears most of it, but if not all, under the criteria of international law. Politically, of course, this is a debate that's far from settled. The recognition of a statehood is not just a matter of legal standards, but it's also political will and international relations. For now, the answer depends on who you ask and which side in history you want to be on. So thank you for tuning in. It's a very contentious issue, but I think it's one that we really need to speak about and one that hits my home really hard. So if you like these issues, if you like these more political debates, please leave a comment and I'll make more content on this as well, of course, on criminal law. So stay informed, stay engaged, and let's continue to advocate for a fairer world. I'll see you in the next video.